The Exile order came with the taste of iron in her mouth and the Alpha King's seal still wet on the parchment. Sarah had bitten through her lower lip when they clamped the cold iron manacles around her wrists, not from fear but from the effort of not screaming his name, Kaelin, her mate, the man who had pressed his thumb into the hot wax himself, whose dark eyes had found hers once, across the great hall before he looked away. And she understood then that the looking away was the cruelest thing he had ever done, not the order, not the manacles. The fact that he had looked and then chosen not to hold her gaze. 7 years. 7 years since the bond had snapped into place, the first time he touched her hand in the silver-lit clearing outside the Ashmont compound, and now he could not hold her gaze for 7 seconds. She was 29 years old. She had committed no crime that the Pack's law recognized, only the crime of being born on the wrong side of a bloodline, of carrying a grandmother's memory in her marrow. A grandmother who had reportedly bargained with the creatures that lived past the Veil Reach, the territory beyond the Pine Ridge where the alpha wolves stopped patrolling and something older and stranger began. That was the charge they wrote on the parchment. Tainted lineage, probable sympathizer with creatures of the Reach, potential corrupting influence on the King's line. She had never even been to the Veil Reach. She had never met a creature from beyond the Pine Ridge. She had loved Callan Ashmont with a specific and undivided ferocity for 7 years, and she had never once asked for more than what a mate bond was supposed to guarantee: standing, safety, the right to remain. They stripped the mate mark collar from her throat in the courtyard at 4 a.m, in the dark, in front of 40 Pack members who had been roused from sleep and assembled as witnesses. She had counted them, 48. Not one of them stepped forward, not one voice lifted. They watched, and not one person intervened. And Sierra made herself memorize their faces in the torchlight, because she understood that memory was the only weapon they had failed to confiscate. The Pine Ridge was 3 miles east. The Veil Reach beyond it was said to be death itself. Fog that moved like it was thinking. Trees that leaned inward over the path. Creatures that ate warmth instead of flesh and left you cold and breathing and hollow. Every wolf pup in the Ashmont compound had grown up on stories of what lived past the pines. The stories were a leash. Sarah had understood that, even when she was small, they pushed her through the compound gate with dawn still 2 hours away. She did not look back. The cold hit her first. October cold with teeth, the kind that found the spaces between your jacket buttons and settled there. They had left her clothes at least, had not stripped that final dignity, though she suspected it was less mercy than practicality. A naked woman found frozen at the ridgeline would require explanations that were inconvenient. The manacles had been removed at the gate, iron still warm from her skin, and the guard who handed her back her coat had not met her eyes either. Another face memorized. She walked east because there was nothing else to do. The path to the ridge was a deer trail, unmarked, cutting through brown autumn grass that rasped against her shins. Above her, the sky was still deep black, fading to the particular blue-gray that preceded dawn, and the stars were cold and indifferent and beautiful, in the way that things are beautiful when they do not care about you. Sarah had always liked that quality in stars. She had learned it from her grandmother, who used to sit outside the east window and name constellations not by their official designations, but by their shapes as she saw them. The bent needle, the open hand, the wolf who walks alone. The wolf who walks alone, she almost laughed. Her feet knew the ground even in the dark, because a wolf's feet always know terrain they have walked before. And she had walked as far as the deer trail's first bend many times as a child, daring herself, stopping before the point where the pines thickened into the ridge proper. Now she walked past that bend without slowing. The trail began to climb. The grass gave way to packed dirt and exposed root, and then to pine needle duff, thick and soft and silent, so that her footsteps disappeared entirely, and she moved through the dark like something that was already half gone. The bond throb in her chest was the worst part. They had taken the physical mark from her throat, but the internal tether, the warm weight of awareness that was Kaelin, that had lived in the space behind her sternum for 7 years like a second heartbeat, had not gone anywhere. She could feel him even now, distant and muffled as if through wool, but present. She wondered if he could feel her moving away. She wondered if it cost him anything. She decided that wondering about that was a door she was not going to open tonight, and she closed it, and she kept walking. The Pine Ridge proper began, where the trees grew close enough together that she had to turn sideways to pass between them. They were old growth, these pines, not the managed plantation pines of the compound's eastern border, but wild trees that had been growing since before the Ashmont pack had a name, their bark deeply furrowed and dark, their roots surfacing from the earth like the backs of buried things. The smell changed. That was the first thing. The sharp resin smell of ordinary pine shaded into something deeper and stranger. A damp, almost mineral smell, like stone and water, and something she had no word for. A smell that was not threatening but was absolutely not neutral. A smell that said, "This place is already occupied." The fog came in at the ridge's crest. She had expected it, had been told about it since childhood, and still the sight of it stopped her breath. It was not like normal fog. Normal fog sat in hollows and valleys, dissipated in the light, moved with wind. This fog was banked against the far side of the ridge like a wall, dense and luminous with a faint interior glow she could not attribute to any light source. Because there was no light source, no moon behind clouds, no distant compound lights, nothing. The fog simply held its own dim light, the way certain deep-sea creatures hold their own light, because they have lived long enough in the dark to generate it. She stood at the ridge crest and looked at it for a long moment. Tainted lineage, the parchment had said. Her grandmother had allegedly bargained with what lived here. Sarah did not know if that was true. What she knew was that her grandmother had been the most pragmatic woman she had ever met. A woman who believed in what was useful and what was kind, and very little else. And that if her grandmother had made a bargain with something past this ridge, she had done it for a reason that mattered. And she had done it clear-eyed, and she had not been ashamed of it. Sarah stepped into the fog. The cold changed quality immediately. Not colder, exactly. The temperature might have dropped a degree or two, but the texture of the cold was different. The fog felt like wading through something just thicker than air. It muffled sound in layers. First, the rustling of her clothing went quiet. Then, the sound of her own breathing seemed to move away from her. And then there was a long, strange moment when she could hear nothing but her heartbeat, which sounded very loud and very clear, as if the fog had stripped away everything that wasn't essential to demonstrate what remained. She kept walking. The trees on this side of the ridge were different. Older, she thought at first, and then revised. It was not age exactly, but scale. Everything was slightly larger than it should have been, in the particular way of things that had grown without interference. Ferns spread wide as tables at her feet. Mushrooms rose in arcs around the bases of the trees, each one broader across the cap than her outspread hand. The bark of the trees was not pine bark, but something smoother and darker, and it held the fog's faint luminescence in a way that turned the forest floor into something between night and early morning. A permanent not quite dark that she found, to her surprise. She could see in reasonably well. She had been walking for approximately 20 minutes. The sky above the ridge behind her was beginning to lighten at the very edges, false dawn turning the black to deep gray, when she became aware of being watched. It was not a sound. There were sounds. The soft settling of a branch somewhere to her left, the quick shift of something small in the undergrowth to her right. But the awareness of being watched came from somewhere below those sounds, from the ancient animal part of her that the wolf self had honed, and the human years had never quite buried. The space between her shoulder blades tightened. She did not stop walking, because stopping felt like confirming fear, and she was done confirming things for anyone tonight. "You came through the ridge on foot," said a voice. She stopped. The voice had come from slightly above her and to the left, and when she turned toward it, she found herself looking at a man sitting on a branch of one of the enormous old trees with the relaxed posture of someone who had been there a long time. He was difficult to see clearly in the fog light. Details came in layers as she looked. Broad through the shoulders, dark clothes that blended with the bark, a quality of stillness that was not human stillness. His eyes caught the fog glow and reflected it in a way that human eyes did not. Not a wolf, something else. "I walk through the ridge because the alternative was standing on the other side of it," she said. Her voice came out steady. She was pleased by that. "Most wolves don't walk through the ridge," the man said. He had an accent she couldn't place. Not regional. More like someone who had learned language as a second or third thing, who had arrived at it analytically, rather than growing up inside it. "Most wolves stop at the tree line. Some of them throw things at the fog from a safe distance, and then run back to their packs and tell stories about how terrifying it was." "I've heard the stories," Sarah said. "I grew up on them, Ashmont pack," he said. Not a question. He had come down from the branch while she was speaking, landing without sound on the needle duff, and now he stood at what she judged to be a careful and considerate distance, neither threatening nor fleeing. Up close, the details were still difficult. His face had the quality of something that had been very beautiful once and still was, but in the way of something old rather than something young. Old in the same way the trees were old, not aged, pre-aged, there from the start. "Was," she said, "Ashmont pack was. I was exiled at dawn." Something shifted in his expression. Not surprise, it was too still a face for surprise, but a recalibration, as if a measurement he had been taking had come back different than expected. At dawn, he repeated. And you arrived here before sunrise. I walked fast. You walked fast, he agreed, and there was something in his voice that was almost, not quite, warmth. What is your name, Sarah? What is yours? He was quiet for a moment, in the way of someone deciding how much truth to give. Ro, he said finally, I hold this territory. On behalf of what? On behalf of itself, he said. The Reach does not belong to anyone in the way your packs mean when they say belong. I tend it. I am responsible for what happens here. What happens here is also responsible for me. He tilted his head, and the fog light caught his profile, and Sarah had a sudden, sharp impression of wings. Not literal, nothing so simple, but the quality of wings in his stillness. The way large winged things are still between beats, storing rather than resting. You came through the fog and the fog let you, he said. That is not nothing. What does it mean? It means you have something in your blood that recognizes this place, he said. Or that this place recognizes you. Her grandmother's face moved through her mind, the east window, the bent needle, the open hand, the wolf who walks alone. My grandmother, she said. Tell me her name. Merit Voss before she took the Ashmont name. She died 14 years ago. The recalibration again, more definitive this time. Ro looked at her with an expression that had moved past assessment into something more complicated and more careful. Merit Voss, he said, came here 41 years ago with a wound she could not heal by pack means, and she stayed for 3 months. And she left carrying something that was not hers by birth but that she had genuinely earned, and which she was trusted to pass to whoever in her line could hold it. He paused. I wondered if that person would ever come. Sarah stood very still in the fog and the dark and processed that. 41 years ago. Her grandmother had been in her late 20s. Before the Ashmont mating, before Sarah's mother was born, in the years of her grandmother's life that no one had spoken about much, and that Sarah had always sensed, childlike, were a contained country with its own weather. She had not known about the Reach. She had not known about the bargain. She had grown up in the compound knowing only that her grandmother watched stars and named them differently, and grew herbs in the east window boxes, that the other pack women said smelled strange, and that when Sarah was sick, her grandmother put her hands on the back of her neck, and Sarah felt better by morning, not gradually but all at once, as if a switch had been found and turned. The hands, always the hands. What did she carry out? Sarah said. A healing gift, Rose said. Reach-born, not wolf, not human, something older. It does not live in a body naturally. It has to be invited in and anchored to a bloodline by consent. Your grandmother consented. She knew it would pass to her children or her children's children. She knew whoever received it might not know it was there until the moment they needed it. He looked at her with those light-catching eyes. You needed it tonight. I need a lot of things tonight, Sarah said. What I need most immediately is somewhere to sit down and not be in the Ashmont compound. Something happened at the corner of his mouth that was not quite a smile, but was in the vicinity of one. I can provide that, Rose said. Come. He turned and walked deeper into the Reach without waiting to see if she would follow, and she followed him, because she was exiled and it was nearly dawn, and her mate's pack was 3 miles behind her, and the fog light was the only illumination she had. And because her grandmother had made a bargain with this place and earned something here and trusted it to be passed on, and Sarah Voss, Sarah Ashmont, Sarah, she told herself, just Sarah now, had walked through the ridge on foot in the dark before sunrise and the fog had let her in, and that had to mean something. The Reach opened up beyond the initial tree line. She had expected it to grow darker, stranger, more difficult as she walked deeper, but it did the opposite. The trees spread apart, giving way to clearings where the luminescent fog pooled in hollows, and the sky above was visible in patches, and in those patches, the stars were extraordinary, not the stars she knew from the compound but somehow more, as if the Reach's particular light pollution was of a kind that made them brighter rather than dimmer, which was not how light worked, and she noted this anomaly and filed it alongside all the other anomalies and kept walking. Ro walked without looking back to see if she kept up, but he also never moved faster than she could comfortably match, which she registered as its own kind of courtesy. They came to a structure that was less a building than a gathering of very old walls, stone, low, covered in the same moss that covered the tree roots, with a roof that was more living roof than built roof turf, and plants growing in a thick layer over a framework she could only just see beneath them. Warm light moved inside through a narrow opening that served as door, and when she followed Ro through it, the warmth hit her like a hand pressed gently to her chest, immediate and total. Inside was a single room with a fire in a stone hearth and a long bench covered in what appeared to be folded wool, and a rough table, and shelves on one wall dense with containers and bundles and items she could not immediately identify, and an atmosphere that was not human built for humans but was not unwelcoming. She sat on the bench because Ro had said come and she had come, and her legs were beginning to acknowledge what her mind had been refusing to acknowledge, which was that she had been standing for hours, and walking for hours, and her body had earned the right to sit down. He put something in front of her on the table, a cup. She looked at it. What is it? Tea, he said. Whatever that means to you, in this context it means warm and leaf-based and not dangerous. She drank it. It tasted of something deep and mineral, and faintly sweet, like water from very old stone, and almost immediately the particular cold that had been living in her chest since the courtyard. Not temperature cold, but the other kind, the kind that came from having watched 48 people look at their feet, began, not to lift, but to soften slightly at the edges. She sat with the cup in both hands and let herself be still for the first time since she had heard the knock on her door at 3 a.m, and opened it to find the exile order waiting. How long can I stay here, she said. Ro was at the shelves doing something with his back to her, and he did not answer immediately. When he did, it was careful. The Reach is not a permanent home for wolves, he said. Even wolves with Reach blood in them. You are a pack creature by nature. You need connection the way trees need root contact. There are limits. He turned to look at her. But I do not believe you intend to stay. No, she said. You intend to return. I intend to return, she confirmed, when I have something to return with. He was quiet for a moment, and then he nodded once, a motion that carried the weight of decision rather than acknowledgement. Then we should begin, he said, with what your grandmother left you. The days in the Reach that followed were not like any days Sarah had known. Time moved differently in the fog, not faster or slower exactly, but in a different ratio of light to dark than she was used to, as if the sun traveled a slightly altered path above the ridge and delivered its hours in a different denominator. She woke each morning to a light that was already soft and diffuse, and she slept when the fog glow faded to almost nothing, and between those 2 points she worked. Ro was a teacher who taught by demonstration and question, rather than instruction. He would do a thing, draw up water from the spring that ran beneath one of the root-vaulted chambers he showed her on the second day, or tend a portion of the forest where something had gone wrong in the growth pattern, pressing his hands to the bark of a tree that had been damaged by something she could not see. And she would watch, and then he would turn and look at her with an expression of patient expectation, and she would try. The first 3 times she tried to access what her grandmother had left in her blood. She felt nothing. Not absence, it was not nothing, but a quality of locked, as if the thing was there and had weight and temperature and was absolutely present, but was behind a door that she was pressing on from the wrong angle. She told Ro this. He nodded. You are used to pushing, he said. Pack wolves push. You assert, you challenge, you take. This is not that. This is older. This is how the Reach moves things. Not by push but by opening. That's abstract, she said. Yes, he said without apology. She tried a different way. She stopped pressing and instead tried to find the place in her chest where the thing lived. Different from the bond warmth of Callan, different from the wolf self's heat. Something cooler and deeper, running down through her like groundwater runs through stone. Always moving, never still. Invisible until you knew to look for it. On the 4th day, she found it. On the 5th day, she touched it. On the 6th day, she opened it. And the thing that came through was not what she had expected. She had expected warmth, because healing was warm in the stories. What came was light, a low, steady, sourceless light that emanated from her palms and spread through whatever she touched in a way that was entirely biological, but not at all normal. That showed her, at skin level, what was wrong and what needed doing. There it is, Ro said. And she heard in his voice something that had not been there before, something sissified and old and genuinely glad. She practiced on the damaged trees. She practiced on a section of the spring-fed channel that had been blocked and was going stagnant. She practiced on a wound that Ro showed her in the very fabric of the Reach itself, a old hurt from decades back that had not fully healed. And when she worked on that one, the light from her hands was stronger than it had been before, and the sensation of working it was both exhausting and deeply settling, the way certain hard things are settling because they demand your entire self and leave nothing over for worry. In the evenings, sitting by the fire in the stone and turf room, she talked to Ro, not about Callan at first, about her grandmother. The stories Ro told her, the 3 months Merritt Voss had spent in the Reach, the wound that Ro still would not name specifically but that had clearly been a wound of the spirit rather than the body. Something torn by betrayal or loss that needed time and ancient, indifferent attention to close. He said her grandmother had left not defeated but clarified. Sarah liked that word, clarified, like metal, like water, clarified. On the 9th night she said Callan's name in the firelight, and Ro looked at her with those careful eyes and did not ask a question, and she talked for a long time. About the 7 years, about the bond, about the specific quality of loving someone whose power was larger than their capacity for loyalty. About the moment in the great hall when he had looked at her, and then looked away and she had understood everything in that single withdrawal of gaze. She talked until the fire was low and her voice had gone quiet, and Ro did not offer comfort or analysis, which was exactly right, which was what she needed, to be heard without being managed. The bond, she said finally. I can still feel it, even here. That will not change, Ro said. Mate bonds are not dissolved by exile orders or pack law. Only by death or by a ritual severance that both parties have to agree to. He didn't offer that, she said. No. Which means either he still wants to be bonded to me, she said, thinking it through, or he doesn't care enough to sever it, or severing it would cost him something in terms of pack standing that he's not willing to pay. Yes, Rose said. All of those may be true at once. She stared at the fire. I used to think love that complicated was still love, she said. I'm not sure I believe that anymore. He did not respond to that, which was also right. There were things that were true that did not need agreement. On the 12th day, she found the second thing. She had been practicing with the reachlight in one of the outer clearings, when she noticed that the fog, which had been behaving as usual, pooled in the low places, moving with its own slow internal current, was doing something different in the farthest corner of the clearing. It was banking up, dense and tall, and within it something was moving. Not a creature, a pattern. She walked toward it, and the light in her hands changed, brightening and shifting from the warm amber it usually held to something clearer and whiter, and the pattern in the fog resolved, gradually, over the course of several minutes of her standing still and the light doing its work, into a vision. Her grandmother. Young, mid-20s, the face Sarah knew from photographs taken before the Ashmont years, before Sarah's mother was born. Standing in this same clearing, doing what Sarah now recognized was the same practice Ro had been teaching her. But with an additional motion Sarah had not learned yet, a turn of the wrists at the end that extended the light outward into the air as a shape, not just a contact healing but a structure, a thing that persisted. And then the vision showed the Ashmont compound. Not in the fog but in her own mind, overlaid, simultaneous. She saw the compound and saw it clearly in a way she had not been able to see it while living inside it, because proximity makes things difficult to see. She saw the logic of it. The fear that ran through it like the bad channel in the spring, stagnant, blocked, making everything downstream sour. She saw where it had started, or close to where. Not with Kaylin, not even with his father, but further back, with the story that the vile reach was death, with the story that her grandmother's bloodline was tainted, with the thing that fear does when it runs an institution long enough, which is that eventually the institution starts to need its fears the way it needs its walls. She had been a convenient embodiment of something the pack had been afraid of for decades before she was born. She stood in the clearing for a long time after the vision faded. Then she went back to Ro and told him what she had seen, and he listened, and when she finished he said, "There is a third thing also." "Show me," she said. The third thing took 4 more days to learn, and was harder than the first 2 in a different way. Not technically difficult, but requiring something that she had to locate within herself, that she had been protecting carefully for a long time. The third thing was this. She could extend the reachlight outward as her grandmother had turned it in the vision, shaped it into something visible and structural. Not just healing but witnessing. A light that showed what was true, not what the caster wanted to be true, or what was convenient, or what the pack had voted to call true. What was actually true. The difficulty was not in the extension of the light. The difficulty was in trusting her own perception completely. She had spent 7 years in an institution that had trained her to hedge, to qualify, to soften her knowing with doubt. The reachlight needed no hedging. It needed total commitment to what she saw. She had to stop halfway through every attempt for 3 days, because every time she reached the point of full extension she flinched, a full-body flinch of the spirit, the habit of a woman who had learned that her clear perception was inconvenient to the people around her. On the 4th day she did not flinch. She held it open and let it extend, and the light went out from her hands in a shape that was not fire, and not flood but something between, a clean, unsparing illumination that lit everything it touched with absolute honesty. and she stood in it and let it run through her and over and out of her until her hands shook with the effort and her knees hit the ground, and she had to stay there for a while, breathing, before she could get up. Ro crouched beside her, not touching, present. She never taught this to anyone, he said quietly. Merit. She carried it alone. Why? Because no one in her line was ready, he said, until you were exiled into the territory that would give you a reason to need it. Sarah sat on the cold ground of the reach with her shaking hands in the moss and looked at the sky through the gap in the trees, where the stars were doing their different here brightness, and felt something move through her that was not rage and not grief and not triumph, but something that contained all three and was larger than all three. The particular feeling of understanding why the hardest thing in your life was the shape it needed to be. Kaylin signed the order, she said. He still feels like my mate. Yes, that's not going to change what I do. No, Ro said. I did not think it would. She looked at her hands, which were steadying. How long have I been here? 17 days, he said. 17 days. In the compound, 17 days would have been enough time for the exile to be formalized, recorded, folded into the pack's official history as a closed matter. Long enough for the story to be set, for the pack to have agreed on its version, for the witnesses in the courtyard to have told themselves whatever they needed to believe about what they had watched. Long enough also for the bond thread between her and Callan to have gone strange. She had been feeling it change for the past several days. The warmth behind her sternum, that had always been steady present, shifting to something more agitated and irregular, like a signal starting to break up. Not fading, disrupted. The disruption had the flavor, in the animal sense where the bond communicated in impressions rather than words, of something wrong in him. Not grief, not guilt, though both were probably present in whatever emotional weather Callan was moving through. Something more acute, physical. She mentioned this to Ro. He was quiet for a moment and then said, the Alpha King's bond to an exiled mate does not simply sit undisturbed. The pack will have noticed. There will be pressure to sever it formally, or to demonstrate that he has severed it, Ro said. Whether or not the ritual actually completes, the pack will need to see him choose. And if he tries to sever it without my consent? He can attempt the ritual, Ro said. Without your consent, it will not complete, but it will hurt him, and it will hurt you, and the attempt itself will leave a mark on the bond that is. He paused, selecting the word, indelible. The bond snapped like a wire pulled to its limit sometime in the small hours of the 18th night. Not snapped entirely. That was not the right word, because it didn't break, not completely. But it went taut in a way it never had before, and then there was a sound she heard only in her body, not in her ears, a deep resonant twang like a very large instrument being struck, and pain moved through her chest and up through her throat, and she sat upright in the dark of the stone room, breathing hard and pressing her palm flat over her sternum the way you would press a hand over a wound. The reach light came up automatically in her palms, amber and steadying, and she let it. It pressed gently against the place the bond had hurt, and did what it did, showed her what was true. What was true was that the bond still lived. The severance ritual had been attempted and had failed because she had not consented and was not present, and the failure had left the bond, scarred and irregular but intact, and Callan, wherever he was, had just learned that the exile order was not going to be enough to unmoor what the wolf recognized. She did not feel sorry for him. She got up, because sitting in the dark nursing a bond wound was a thing she had done before, the night after the exile, on this same bench, and she was not going to do it in the same way twice. She went out into the reach and let the fog close around her, and she walked, not far, just to the nearest clearing, and she stood in the center of it with her hands open at her sides and the light running quiet and steady from her palms, like something that had decided to be responsible for itself. And she thought about what she was going to do, not what she wanted to do. She was past the phase of the story where wanting guided her. What she was going to do. She was going to go back. She was going to go back not to be forgiven, or to be reinstated, or to stand in the compound, as Kellen Ashmont's mate, and watch him look away when things got difficult. She was going to go back because 48 people had watched her taken away in manacles, and not one of them had spoken, and she knew that silence. She knew what it cost, and she knew the thing that made it possible, which was the same blocked channel that ran through everything in the compound, the same fear story told about her grandmother's blood, and the Veil Reach, and what lived past the pines. She was going to go back because her grandmother had earned something in this fog, and had trusted it to move through blood into someone who would know what to do with it. And Sarah knew what to do with it. She was going to light the compound up with the truth, and see which walls were walls, and which walls were only stories. On the 19th day she went to Ro and told him she was ready. He looked at her for a long moment with those light-catching eyes, and then he said, "There is one more thing." She waited. "When you cross back through the ridge," he said, "the fog will come with you. Not everywhere, not forever, but enough. It will follow the reachlight because the reachlight is its kin, and it will go where the light goes, and it will be seen." He paused. "They will see it coming." "Good," Sarah said. "The Alpha King will see it coming," he said. "He will feel the bond move toward him, and he will see the fog at the ridgeline, and he will know what that combination means." "Good," she said again. "You are not afraid of what that does to him?" She thought about that honestly because he deserved honesty and so did she. "I want him to feel it," she said finally. "I want him to stand in the compound and feel the bond pull toward the ridge and see the reach fog cross the tree line, and I want him to understand in the 30 seconds between seeing it and seeing me what he signed when he pressed his thumb in that wax. I want him to have those 30 seconds of full understanding. That is not cruelty. That is just truth." Ro looked at her, and the thing at the corner of his mouth that was in the vicinity of warmth moved fully into warmth for the first time since she had arrived. "Your grandmother," he said, "would have said something much sharper than that." Sarah smiled. The first full smile in 19 days, she thought, and the smile felt like something that belonged to her alone, made in the reach from different material than what the compound had built in her. She left at the following dawn. Before she went, Rose stood at the entrance of the stone room and said, "You can come back. The reach does not close to Voss blood." He looked at her with the full weight of what he was. Old, responsible for this territory, something between guardian and embodiment. Merritt came back twice more in later years, not for healing. To tend the old wound she had healed, and to walk in the fog because it agreed with her. "I know," Sarah said. And she did know, though she had not consciously known it before. Her grandmother's east window herbs, her grandmother's hands. The morning 2 weeks before she died when she had sat with Sarah in the early light and told her to pay attention to the wolf, who walks alone because the lone wolf knows things the pack forgets. She had been telling her. Marit Voss had been telling her for years. "Thank you," she said to Ro, and meant it as specifically as she could, not as a pleasantry, but as a precise recognition of what she was thanking him for, which was letting her grandmother, in 41 years ago, and letting her work and honoring the chain of it. He nodded once the decision motion. "Walk carefully," he said. "The deer trail is icy at the top of the ridge at this hour." She laughed, actual, genuine, and went. The ridge was icy at the top. He was right about that. She came through the pines with her boots, finding purchase on frozen needle duff and the fog trailing her at a distance. Not dramatic, not rolling like a storm, but moving as water moves, steadily and at its own pace, and with no particular interest in what any onlooking creature thought about it. The sky above was beginning to go pink at the eastern edge, near dawn then, near the time she had left. She stood at the ridge crest for a moment and looked out over the 3 miles of deer trail, and brown grass and frozen ground between her and the compound gates. And she felt the bond in her chest move and shift and lean forward, the way a compass needle moves toward north, pulling toward him, toward Callan Ashmont, who had looked at her and then looked away. And she let it pull because the pull had stopped being about wanting and had become something more structural than that. A fact about her body the way gravity was a fact, acknowledged, accounted for, neither controlled by nor controlling. She walked down from the ridge. The bond woke up fully as she came down the slope, shaking off the muffled quality the distance had given it and becoming vivid again. She could feel him sharply now, could feel that he was awake, which meant he was already at the windows or already outside, because a mated wolf always woke when the bond moved toward them with this kind of intention. She wondered if he was afraid. She found she was genuinely uncertain about what he was feeling, and the uncertainty sat cleanly in her. Not the anxious wondering of before, not the constant monitoring of his emotional weather that she had been doing for years, but a clean curiosity, the kind you had about things you were about to walk into on your own terms. The compound came into view at the end of the deer trail. The fog was behind her, not dense but visible, a low diffuse luminescence that moved through the brown grass the way light moves through thin cloth, everywhere and sourceless. She could see the eastern watch post and the figure there, and she could see when the figure registered her, the small sharp shift of posture that meant recognition followed immediately by the longer, stranger shift that meant the fog was visible too. The watch called out. She heard the sound but not the words at this distance. Other figures appeared at the wall. By the time she reached the compound gate, there were people at the wall, and she could see through the gaps in the eastern fence that the courtyard beyond the gate was filling. not with a crowd that had been roused and assembled by force the way the Exile crowd had been assembled at 4 in the morning, but with a crowd that was coming under its own power, drawn by the hutch call and the bond sensation and the sight of reach fog crossing the open ground at dawn, and what it meant. She stopped outside the gate. She did not knock. She did not call out. She stood outside the gate, with the reach light running in her palms and the fog distributing itself quietly through the morning air around her. And she waited, and the gate opened. Callan was on the other side of it. He looked as if he had not slept in 19 days, which was possible. He looked as if he had run from wherever he had been to get to the gate, which was also possible. He was still the man she knew in every physical specific, the particular width of his shoulders, the way he held his jaw when he was trying to control his expression, the eyes that she had memorized so thoroughly she could have drawn them from memory in the dark. And looking at all of that was not painless. She had not thought it would be painless. Pain was not the measure of anything. He stared at her, and then at the light in her hands, and then at the fog, and then back at her face, and she watched him arrive at the understanding she had promised Ro he would arrive at. The full weight of what the Exile order had done, and what the severance attempt had failed to do, and what it meant that she was standing at the gate of his compound with reach light in her hands, and reach fog at her back at dawn on the 19th day. "Sarah," he said, and his voice had no performance in it at all, which was the first honest thing she had heard from him in a long time. "Alpha King," she said, and it was not cruelty, it was just precision. He flinched. She watched it go through him, and felt the bond respond to his pain the way it had always responded, with a deep biological pull toward comfort that she recognized fully, and followed not at all. The courtyard behind him was full. She could see faces over his shoulder, some she recognized, some of the 48, some she did not know, all watching. Good. Let them watch. Let them watch something different than what they had watched 19 days ago. "You came back through the Reach," Callan said. "I came back from the Reach," she said. "That is different." He looked at her hands. The light was steady, amber warm, unhurried. "What is that?" "My grandmother's inheritance," she said, "which she earned in the Vale Reach 41 years ago, which the pack has been calling a taint in my bloodline since before I was born." She let her voice carry. She had a strong voice when she chose to use it. "I would like the pack to hear that clearly. Marit Voss was not tainted. She was gifted. The difference between those two words is everything that was wrong with the story you have all been telling." Silence in the courtyard. Not the silence of agreement or disagreement, but the silence of a crowd that has been given something to reckon with and is in the early stages of reckoning. Callan took a step toward her. "The Exile order is a document," she said. "I know what it says. I was there when the wax was pressed." She held his gaze, and she did not look away, and she let him feel the full difference between his looking away in the great hall and her standing here now not looking away. "I am not here to contest it." "Then why?" "I am here," she said, "because there are 7 people in this compound who are sick and have not been healing by pack means." She had seen this in the vision. "I know their names. I know what is wrong. I came back because my grandmother's gift is a healing gift and I know how to use it now. And I'm not going to withhold it from people who need it because the pack that exiled me decided to call it a contamination." More silence. A different quality. "After I have done what I came to do," she continued, and now she was speaking past Callan, past the Alpha King, to the courtyard and its watching faces, "I will leave again. The Vale Reach is not a death territory. It is older than this compound, and it is not hostile to wolves who do not approach it with hostility. You have been afraid of it for decades because fear is easier to sustain than knowledge." She looked at the faces. She looked for the 48, found them in clusters, which people who share a guilt always arrange themselves. "I walked in alone. I came back alive and with something I did not have before. You can make of that what you choose." Callan stood in the gate, and he was not moving aside, and he was not advancing, and she could feel through the bond the specific quality of his stillness, which she had learned over 7 years, which was the stillness of a man who was processing something faster than he could speak, and was genuinely uncertain of the ground, and did not know what to do with that uncertainty. Because he had been Alpha King long enough, that uncertainty felt like failure. She looked at him directly. "I am not asking for reinstatement," she said, and she let it be clear, completely clear, that this was not a negotiating position but the actual truth. "I am not asking you to reverse the exile. I am not here to come back." The bond pulled hard at that. She felt it, he felt it, she could see it in his face. "I am here because my grandmother earned something in the Reach, and trusted it to whoever in her line could hold it. and it turns out that holding it required being sent through the ridge at dawn with iron marks on my wrists in front of 48 witnesses who did not speak. She looked at the courtyard. She looked at all of them. So in a way, she said, and her voice was not warm now, but it was not cold either. It was simply level. You are all part of how this works. The bond snapped again, not in the severance way, not in pain, but in the way it had never snapped before in 7 years, which was in revelation. It was, she realized, the feeling of it being finally fully known, not happy, not resolved, known. She stepped forward, and Callan stepped aside, and she walked into the compound with the reach light in her palms and the fog, which had waited patiently through all of this, following her in over the threshold in slow drifts, as if it too had been waiting for permission to enter, and was glad now to come out of the cold. The first person she went to was a woman named Dara, who was 46 years old, and had been told for 2 years that the illness in her joints was age and wolf constitution, and to endure it, and who Sarah found exactly where she had seen her in the vision. In the north-facing room of the second residence building, lying on her side in the gray morning light with the blanket pulled up and her breathing shallow. Dara looked at Sarah in the doorway with the look of a woman who had accepted the compound's terms and was still surprised when something broke them. They said you were dead, she said. Her voice was thin and tired. I'm not, Sarah said. She crossed to her and sat on the edge of the bed and put her hands on the woman's arm. And the reach light ran in immediately, amber going white, going clear, showing her the specific cold spot in Dara's shoulder joint that was not arthritis, but was a small and treatable knot of the same energy the reach called wound. A spirit hurt that had calcified over time into something physical, the way grief will, eventually, if you do not move it. She worked it for 14 minutes by her internal count. Dara lay still and let her work, and at the end her breathing changed, deepened and regularized, and she looked at Sarah with an expression that was complicated and grateful and something else. Merritt's girl, she said. Yes, Sarah said. She put her hands on my mother once, Dara said. Long before your time, I was 7. I watched her do it in this same building. She was quiet for a moment. The pack called it strange even then. The pack calls things in strange when it doesn't understand them, Sarah said, and then writes the strangeness as danger. She stood. You should sleep. It will settle fully while you sleep. She went through all 7 of them. It took most of the morning. The light in her hands fluctuated with the work. Brighter on the harder cases, softer on the ones where the wound was small and recent, and the body already knew what direction to go. She was aware peripherally of being followed through the compound as she moved from building to building, not by a crowd but by individuals at cautious distances, people watching, and among them, always somewhere in the periphery, Callan. She did not address him again. She did not address the watching people. She did what she had come to do. The 7th person was a child, a boy of 8 who had developed, over the past 6 months, an inability to shift that the pack's healers had not been able to explain. A wolf child who could not shift was not a crisis of the body but a crisis of identity, and the pack treated it as embarrassing, which was the worst possible medicine. Sarah sat with the boy in his parents' presence and put the light on him and found the problem immediately. A binding, not natural, not self-generated, but left there by accident or by something that had brushed against him and not meant to stay. The kind of thing that happened near old territory boundaries when they were poorly maintained, which the Ashmont eastern boundary had been, because the pack had been afraid of the ridge and had not maintained the boundary marks in 40 years. That was also information. She noted it for later. She removed the binding with 15 minutes of careful reach work that required her to move slowly and explain what she was doing to the boy in real time, because he was 8 and deserved to understand what was happening in his own body, and because explanations demystified fear, which was the thing she was done allowing to run unchallenged in this compound. When the binding released, the boy shifted in a sudden rush of instinctive relief, a small gray wolf tumbling across the floor of the room in the first shift of his life, and then shifted back and sat up in the corners, breathing hard with the look on his face that she recognized from every wolf's first shift story, which was the look of someone who had just found the largest room in themselves. She stood up, and the boy's mother was crying quietly and persistently, and Sarah looked at her and said, "He can practice freely now. The boundary marks on the eastern edge need to be redone. That's where it came from, old marks decaying." And then, because she needed to say it clearly one more time, not gently but with precision, the reach did not do this to him. Neglect of the boundary did this to him. There is a difference. The mother nodded, not able to speak. Sarah left the residence and walked back out into the compound courtyard, where the morning had gone fully bright, and the reach fog had thinned, and settled into the low places no longer otherworldly but simply present, like ground mist on a cold day, going about its business. Callan was standing in the center of the courtyard, not in the gate, not at a doorway, in the middle. He had been waiting. She could see it in him. The specific quality of someone who has spent several hours deciding to stand somewhere, and has held the decision. She walked toward him not because she wanted a scene, but because her path back to the gate went through the courtyard's center. And she was not adjusting her route. He spoke before she reached him. "You healed them," he said. "Yes, with reachability." "Yes," he was quiet for a moment. "The Exile order," he said, and his voice was doing something difficult. She could hear the difficulty in it, which was that he was a man who had spent his adult life not having to negotiate his words, and was now finding that the words required more than authority to carry them. The Exile order was wrong. She stopped and looked at him. "Yes," she said, "it was. The council." "Callan," she said, "just his name, just the bare fact of him. I know about the council. I know about the pressure and the politics and the bloodline story, and the faction that has wanted the Voss connection severed for years. I know all of that." She paused. "I also know that you pressed your thumb in the wax. I watched you. And I know that you looked at me in that hall once, and then you looked away." She let that sit. "I'm not interested in the architecture of why. I lived in the compound for 7 years, and I know exactly what the architecture feels like from the inside." He took a breath. "I want to reverse it," he said. "The order. Reinstate you fully. Whatever the formal no," she said. The word was quiet. It was not dramatic. It was simply complete. "Sierra, I am not coming back as your mate and your alpha queen, and the woman who stands at your right, and serves as evidence that the exile was an aberration, and everything is now correct," she said. "I am not going to do that. Not because I don't feel the bond. I feel it right now. I can feel you in my chest the way I have felt you for 7 years, but because the bond is a biological fact and not a judgment. The bond bonded me to you. The bond did not promise me that you would hold my gaze when it cost something." He was very still. She recognized the stillness. "The compound," she said, "has a cracked eastern boundary that has been neglected for 40 years because the pack was afraid of the ridge. I know how to repair it properly. I know how to maintain the marks so that what happened to that boy doesn't happen again. I know what the reach is, and I know how to work with it rather than hiding from it." She looked at him steadily. "That knowledge is worth something to this pack. I am willing to provide it. Not as your mate, not as a reinstated member who owes the pack gratitude for being forgiven her inconvenient blood, but as an independent party with specific skills who negotiates terms." He stared at her. "Those are the terms I am willing to discuss," she said. "If the Alpha King wants to discuss them, I will be outside the eastern boundary this afternoon. If he doesn't, I will do the boundary work anyway, because the child in there needs it, and then I will go." She walked past him to the gate, and the gate was open. She went through it, and behind her she heard nothing for a long moment, and then she heard his footsteps, which was not reconciliation, which was not surrender, which was a man who was a king, and was also a wolf trying to decide which of those things was larger, and she was not going to stand still and make that decision easier. She sat at the compound's eastern boundary, in the thin afternoon light with the reach fog moving in the low grass around her, comfortable and quiet, and she waited to see who would come. Ro had said, "You need connection the way trees need root contact." She understood that. She had known it while she walked through the ridge, had known it while she tended the reach's old wounds, had known it when she talked for hours in the firelight about Callan and love, and the thing that love was when it was not also loyalty. She was not going to become a hermit of the reach. She was not going to exile herself more thoroughly than the Alpha King had managed to. She was a pack creature by nature, and she needed what pack creatures need. But she was going to need it on terms she could stand inside without folding. Dara found her first. Not Callan, not any of the 48, but the woman with the healing shoulder and the 7-year-old memory of Merritt Voss's hands, who came and sat beside her on the cold ground and said nothing for a while, and then said, "There are others. Not sick, not the way the 7 were, but carrying things." She looked at the reach fog and it looked back, or seemed to. "People who have been afraid for a long time." "I know," Sarah said. "Would you?" "Yes," Sarah said. "That is why I came back." Callan came at dusk. She heard him before she saw him. The bond pulled her attention east, where the light was going gold and amber, which was also the color of the reach light in her palms, and she noted that coincidence or non-coincidence with the part of her that was learning to note things, rather than dismiss them. He came alone. He stopped at a careful and deliberate distance that she recognized as a conscious choice, as him choosing not to use proximity as pressure, which was a thing he had always used before, and which she registered as the first honest gesture of the day. I want to discuss the terms, he said. I know, she said. He sat down on the cold ground a few feet from her, which surprised her. The Alpha King, sitting in the dead grass outside his own boundary line in the dusk, without ceremony, which was also a choice. They sat for a moment in the fading light with the bond between them present and unresolved and alive. A fact about both of their bodies that was not going anywhere, and that neither of them was going to pretend was simple. I don't know how to do this, he said finally. This negotiation, I have not negotiated with someone who is not beneath you. She winced. Not already, he stopped. Tried again. I have not negotiated with an equal from a position of having already done wrong to them. I don't have a frame for it. I know, she said, and she did not make it easier. She let him sit with the not having a frame. It was important that he sit with it. They sat for a long time in the dusk, and the bond sang between them like a very large instrument that had been struck and was still resonating. And the reach fog moved in the grass, tending its own business, and the stars came out above the ridge, her grandmother's stars, the bent needle, the open hand, the wolf who walks alone. Not alone because she was isolated, but alone because she was whole, because she did not require the pack to complete her, because she had walked into the oldest and most feared territory available to her, and come back with her hands full of light. The boundary work first, she said. We negotiate the rest as we go. But I am not coming back inside those gates as a supplicant. I am not performing gratitude for not being left in the reach. Understood, he said. And I need you to understand, she said, that the bond is not an agreement to forget the Great Hall. I feel you in my chest the way I have always felt you. That does not mean we are where we were. We are not where we were. Where we were was not good enough, and I did not know that clearly enough to say so before. She paused. I know it now. He was quiet. Then, what is it like? The reach. She looked at the ridge line, already fading to black against the darkening sky, and thought about the fog and the old trees and the sourceless light, and Roe with his careful eyes, and the way time moved differently in the hollows. She thought about her grandmother at 20-something, walking through the ridge with a wound that needed different attention than the pack could give. It is like being seen without context, she said, without the story the pack tells about you, without the 7 years of accumulated decisions about who you are. She looked at her hands in the grass. The reach light was very faint now, barely there, banked down for the evening. You go in as what you are, and it works with that, nothing else. He was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke, his voice had something in it she had not heard before in 7 years, which was genuine smallness, not performed humility, not the rhetorical smallness that authority performs when it wants credit for being gracious, but actual smallness, the kind that comes from understanding the size of what you did and what it cost. I don't know if there is anything I can do, he said. That addresses what I did in the Great Hall. No, she said. There isn't, but you're here. I'm here to do work that needs doing, she said. You happen to also be here. She heard the breath he took, and the sound of it, the steadiness he was trying to hold in the cost of trying. She did not soften it for him. She also did not take pleasure in the cost, because that was not what this was. This was not revenge. Revenge required the other person's suffering to be the point. The other person's suffering was not the point. The work was the point. The boundary was the point. Dara's shoulder and the boy's first shift, and the 40 years of maintained fear, and the story about the veil reach that the compound had been using as a leash on itself for longer than she had been alive. Those were the point. And her grandmother's face in the fog vision, her grandmother's bent needle and open hand, and the wolf who walks alone. That was the point also. She stood up and brushed the dead grass from her jacket. And the stars above the ridge were fully present now, cold and brilliant, and doing their thing. The bond moved in her chest, present and real, and not going anywhere. Tomorrow morning, she said, I'll begin the boundary repair on the eastern line. I'll need assistance. Someone who knows the original mark placements from the records. I'll have the records pulled tonight, he said. He was still sitting on the ground, which was something. Good, she said. She walked back toward the ridge, not away from the compound permanently. Her pack creature nature had noted the thin warmth inside those gates and the faces of the 7 she had healed, and Dara sitting beside her in the dead grass, but toward the reach boundary, where the fog lived in the low places, and the old trees leaned over the path, and the stars were larger, and her grandmother had walked a long time ago and earned something, and trusted that the earning was not wasted. She was not the woman who had been pushed through the gate with iron on her wrists. She was not going to pretend to be, for anyone's comfort, including her own. She was Sarah Voss, carrying Merritt Voss's gift in her blood and her hands, and the specific quality of her seeing, and she had walked into the most feared territory the pack knew, and come back with the fog at her back and the light in her palms, and every wall she found from here forward that was only a story she was going to walk through, quietly, with her eyes open, and let it show itself for what it was. The ridge rose before her in the dark, and the stars were brilliant above it, and the fog at the tree line moved in slow greeting, and Sarah walked toward it, neither hurrying nor hesitating, carrying everything she had come back with, leaving nothing behind.